homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm. Thanks for joining me in my kitchen. I am going to make a recipe that I completely fell in love with last year. And this is technically it's a butternut squash lasagna. I think Ottolenghi calls it a squash pie. And we made it last year for a get-together with some friends, and then I decided to make it again this year. This is a vegetarian recipe, lots of cheese and lovely other things, but no meat. And one of my friends that is in this group is a vegetarian, and he absolutely loved it, and he actually doesn't usually like lasagna, so I decided to make it again because it was such a big hit. This is going to have butternut squash in it. This is a butternut that I grew, and you can see this one has quite a bit of scarring on it. The one in the video is also slightly scarred. This is probably from a combination of insect damage. So I had pill bugs out in the garden. This was sitting on landscape fabric, and so they loved that landscape fabric, and so they would just nibble on stuff. And they weren't bad enough to really do any serious damage, but they will cause a little bit of a scar in the fruit, and then it will heal over. And so this is healed over, or it could also be just a lot of water all at once. So sometimes when things are actively growing and you get a rainstorm, or you forget and you leave the hose on for an extra long time, these plants will just have so much water that they will expand the root really quickly, and that will cause some splitting as well. So I sold all of my butternut that were perfect, and then I kept the funky ones for myself because I knew that while they're not going to store into February, there's nothing wrong with them other than that. So they're perfectly good to eat as long as we cut off the scarring, and so these ones I kept for me. This is a really nice sized butternut. Other things that go into this recipe are fresh spinach, and so the fresh spinach and the basil that's in this, the fresh basil did come from the grocery store because it's November, and I just can't get those things out of my own garden this time of year. I could have used frozen spinach that I have from my garden, and so that's an alternative. Dried basil would not be the same in this. You really do want fresh basil, and so I went ahead and paid through the nose for some beautiful fresh basil to put in this recipe. And then the other unique ingredient is it uses some different cheeses than what you would normally see in a lasagna, and one of those is feta. I am a huge lover of feta. I will pretty much eat feta on anything, and it's really beautiful in this recipe. Ottolenghi has a very Middle Eastern, Jerusalem area flavor to his foods, and so he uses a lot of Middle Eastern spices, and that's probably part of why the feta is in there. And then there's some beautiful Parmigiano Reggiano cheese, so real Parmesan from Italy. This was a Friendsgiving event, and so I really kind of pulled out all the stops. I didn't cheap out on the domestic Parmesan. I just went full on. The cool thing about this recipe is instead of tediously layering, a cheese layer and a squash layer and a noodle layer, you just break the noodles up into kind of bite-sized pieces, however they fall, and then mix everything together. And then the squash is sliced thinly as well. And so everything just kind of packs down into a compressed pie, and it's just beautiful, and it's really simple. So don't be intimidated by the list of ingredients here. It looks a little bit long, but in terms of putting it together, it's way less work, in my opinion, than doing a traditional lasagna because you're not having to alternate layers. You're just mixing it all together and smushing it into a pan. The other unique ingredient that's in this is Aleppo pepper, and you could use whatever peppers you had on hand. You could probably use Calabrian peppers, or just a teaspoon of whatever red pepper flakes you happen to have on hand would be fine. Don't feel like you have to go out of your way to get Aleppo. I happen to grow Aleppo because I put it in some of my spice mixes, and so I had it on hand, and it is a delightful kind of middle heat pepper. Calabrian would be another good alternative, I think, in this recipe. But yeah, squash pie or butternut squash lasagna, absolutely delicious and really nice for this time of year when you're trying to feed a big group of people. You want things to be a little bit elevated, but you also want something that isn't going to take you all day. Let's get started. So my favorite way to take the stem off of a squash is to just whack it on the sink. And then butternut are a little bit of a pain to peel with a vegetable peeler, but it's totally doable. And obviously I'm sticking on this scab here, and so I'm just going to trim that part out. But just be patient and hang on to it. You'll probably throw it in the sink accidentally about 6 times, which is usually what happens to me. And then once the butternut is completely peeled, the top part of that is going to be completely solid, and so it's handy to cut it in quarters so that you can get to the cavity easily without having to wrangle the entire squash. And you just scrape out that middle section. And these seeds are totally edible, and you could save them and roast them if you had that inclination. And then I'm cutting this, I want this to be quite thin, so about 1/8 of an inch thick. I could have done this on a mandolin, but it's so wide that I knew it was going to be kind of difficult to do on a mandolin, so I just opted to do this by hand. But basically what you're doing is mimicking the lasagna noodles with the squash pieces so that they mirror each other. So you do want a pretty thin squash here. And then the total weight on this, he calls for a 1 3/4 pound butternut, and mine was a little bigger than that, so I ended up kind of measuring out what I had and setting aside a little bit for extra for some other projects. And I need 8 cloves of garlic, and I'm just going to do a rough chop on these, so smashing them with my knife and then running my knife through them multiple times until things are relatively fine but not super fine. And then into a skillet, I'm going to add quite a bit of olive oil, probably 2 to 3 tablespoons there. And I started that in a cold pan with my garlic. And then spice-wise, I need a tablespoon of cumin, a tablespoon of coriander, 2 teaspoons of Aleppo powder or Aleppo flake. And then 2 tablespoons of tomato paste, and that's a homemade tomato paste that I have. And then once that garlic is starting to smell good, be careful not to burn it, I'm just going to smash my tomato paste into this olive oil and loosen everything up and just basically create a beautiful garlic tomato sauce here. In goes my spices, and I'm going to bloom those in that oil to really bring out all of their flavor goodness. This is a 12-ounce jar of roasted red bell peppers, and I probably have some roasted bell peppers in my freezer somewhere, but I just didn't have the patience to dig through everything and find them, so I just bought a jar. I'm going to drain that, put that in a blender along with your garlic, all of your spices, and your olive oil. A teaspoon of brown sugar, a teaspoon of sea salt, and some fresh ground black pepper. And then I'm going to put that in my blender on low and grind that together to where I get a beautiful sauce for our squash. That gets dumped onto our squash pieces. And then these are our lasagna noodles. He doesn't call for the oven-ready ones. I went ahead and used the oven-ready ones, but I think it would work regardless. There's quite a bit of moisture in that squash, so even if you just have regular lasagna noodles, they're probably going to soften up quite fine. And then I just mashed them with my hand and then broke them up a little bit more. I was kind of looking for about 1-inch pieces here. And then I need 7 ounces of baby spinach, which, as you know, takes up a ton of room. I ended up changing bowls because I didn't have enough room in the bowl that I started with. This is what's going to be packed cup of basil leaves. And I bought those at the grocery store, and if I'd realized they were on the stem, I would have just taken them out of the container and put them in a vase full of water. Basil really hates to be in the refrigerator. Don't refrigerate it. But I kept that actually at room temperature for 4 or 5 days, and I only lost a few pieces. This is a cup of crumbled feta. And then a 1/2 cup of grated Parmesan. Another teaspoon of salt. Some more black pepper. And then everything is getting mixed together. And I'm mostly trying to make sure that I don't end up with a big pocket of sauce here. So I'm kind of just massaging things around in order to spread that sauce out so that it gets everything really nicely coated. And then once I get it all in there, everything is beautifully mixed and we are ready to go into a pan. This is a 9x13 baking pan. He originally calls for a springform pan, and I just thought that was way too fiddly. And also I don't have a springform pan that's big enough to fit all of this, so I just went with the 9x13 pan. It worked just fine. And then I'm packing everything down into this pan. And then this goes into a 400-degree oven covered with tin foil. And you want to cook it for about 45 minutes. And while that's in the oven baking, we're going to make a bechamel sauce. And a bechamel sauce is just a fat, in this case butter, and flour mixed together and toasted to get rid of that raw flour taste. And then you add milk or cream in order to make a cream sauce. And when you first start adding the milk, everything clumps up and it looks really terrible and it looks like it's never going to thin out. And you just keep stirring and adding a little bit at a time and stirring and adding a little bit more. And eventually it thins out and you end up with a beautiful cream sauce. This bechamel was super thick, and 1/3 of a cup of flour to 3 tablespoons of butter is actually a pretty high ratio. Normally you would just match and do 3 tablespoons of butter, 3 tablespoons of flour. So this was a really thick sauce. I think if I did it again, I would probably not add quite so much flour. And spoiler alert here, our guest showed up and I was also making a cheesecake that took about 1/3 longer than I was expecting it to cook. And so everybody showed up and I completely missed filming putting this mixture in the oven and then pulling it out and putting the bechamel sauce on. So I apologize. Giant spoiler alert that you don't get the beautiful big reveal of it coming out of the oven. But suffice it to say, once this is cooked for 45 minutes, this bechamel sauce goes onto it, and into this gets mixed a clove of minced garlic and about 1/4 cup of Parmesan and a little bit of salt and pepper. Take the tin foil off, pour that over the top, and then cook it for another 15 minutes or so until it's starting to get brown spots on the top and it's ready to serve. So I completely missed filming that, and my apologies for that. But I did all this other filming, and this really is one of my very favorite recipes of the year. I absolutely love this. And it's such a different take on a lasagna. Absolutely delicious. So I didn't want to not put this video up, even if I did mess up and not get the great reveal. So please do give this recipe a try, tribe. It is absolutely delicious. It does have a little bit of spice to it, and so you can back off on that if you want, but it's well worth your time to make.
Natural 20 on that. Okay, I was ready. Okay, yeah, you were apparently ready.
Thanks for watching, tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.